Welcome to the final episode of this season of Nuke Talk. We've been diving into the Nuclear Ballot, how the US election shapes nuclear policy. And let's be honest, there's been a lot to talk about when it comes to nuclear weapons and the president this election. Our job was to bring you the best people to break down these big, important issues. Now, if you're one of our early bird listeners who listen to this as soon as we drop an episode, we are just days away from this election. Hopefully, after joining us this season, you've got a solid handle on why this election could have huge consequences for nuclear policy. But if you missed an episode or two, don't worry. You still have time to listen to this season. Or if you're strapped for time, here's a quick recap. We've kicked off by looking at the president's unique power when it comes to nukes. Yes, sole authority. One person has the power to launch a nuclear weapon in the US, and we unpacked the Nuclear Posture Review, which sets nuclear policy for a president's term. And we spoke to W.J. Hennigan and Kathleen Kingsbury from the New York Times to talk about the media coverage of nuclear weapons policy and their series At the Brink. Spoiler alert, nuclear weapons don't get a lot of media coverage. Then, in episode 2, we dug into the military budget and its ripple effects on labs across the country. We even revisited topics from season 3, Atomic Assembly, where we explored US nuclear facilities. We also touched on what happens if the US were to restart nuclear testing, and looked at how those harmed by nuclear weapons testing and production are still fighting for compensation under the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And last episode, we went global. We talked about how this election might change US relationships with China, Russia, and NATO, how both candidates could shape those relationships in very different ways, and how nuclear weapons are right there in the mix. But let's be honest, when people head into the polls, nuclear weapons probably are not top of mind. And we get it. There's a lot riding on this election. Still, as we've been exploring this season, there's a lot at stake when it comes to nuclear weapons policy, so we asked our experts, people who live and breathe this issue every day, what's on their minds when they head into the voting booth on November 5th. And our first guest today is Molly Hurley.
Hi, I'm Molly Hurley. I'm currently a digital storyteller and content strategist for Bombshell Toe Policy and Arts Collective. I also serve as a youth advisor to the nuclear program for the Prospect Hill Foundation. And before that, I've worked as freelance in quite a few other nonprofits, from Reverse the Trend to Women Cross DMZ to Beyond the Bomb. A couple others, some are mixed up in there. And actually most exciting is I'm a culture columnist for Inkstick Media, where I link pop culture with national security, and I talk about what all the silly TikTok dances mean for the broader NatSec and policy space.
With Molly's background in nuclear weapons and national security issues, what's running through her mind as we come close to this election?
I would say the things or people that are most on my mind at the polls are undecided voters, because none of us can assume either candidate has it in the bag. As we've seen a couple of times now, even a win in the popular vote means nothing. The electoral college math isn't mathing, which does go to show that votes do matter, especially this season, without a doubt. However, why is it that we still hear about undecided voters, and what are they even undecided about? I think we need to understand what undecided even means. We typically think of undecided as referring to people who think that both candidates are equally good or equally bad. But undecided voters, as I personally know them, and as having been one myself, am one myself, undecided can also just mean undecided about whether or not to vote at all. I mean, when we look at the foreign policy platforms, and this does umbrella include the nuclear weapons issues that we talked about on this podcast, the Democrats and the Republicans are, in my opinion, equally jingoistic, warmongering, and hegemonic. And as a younger person, I hear, quite frankly, a bit too often older people disregarding young people and their concerns around voting in the first place. I've also been told a few too many times in tones that feel honestly quite patronizing, oh, you'll calm down as you get older. And honestly, that prospect terrifies me, because it makes it sound as if I'll grow complacent with the status quo. It's difficult to hear, especially from older individuals who I know for a fact were once at the front lines of the very picket lines. They're holding the bullhorn at rallies. They're shouting at government buildings and distributing flyers and zines and pamphlets. And it makes me think, you were once me. So how can you stand there patronizing me and putting me down for doing the work that you now say you're too tired to do? I think young people are so beautifully passionate, and maybe there are some things that we do not and cannot understand until we've lived a certain number of years or lived through a certain kind of experience. But to stifle and snuff out our passion with words like, well, you just aren't intelligent enough or informed enough or mature enough to get it, instead of empathically guiding us to other ways we might be able to utilize our passion and our energy, that require telling us we're wrong for feeling held hostage. The reality is, undecided voters, I know, are not undecided because they fail to recognize the stakes in this election, rather because they do recognize those stakes alongside a recognition that neither political party will save us, quote unquote, or save anyone. Undecided voters, as I know them, are undecided because of an increasingly widespread sense of a lack of agency or impact. And this very much applies as well to the disparity that we see between the mass movements that we had in the 80s with the freeze movement on nuclear weapons issues and almost non-existent mass movement on nuclear weapons that we see right now in 2024. And on a lot of other issues, it's this lack of agency, this lack of empowerment. I mean, how many more months will Palestinians face indiscriminate violence and death? How many more months will countries like Iran and North Korea remain sanctioned and isolated, further engendering internal strife, disillusionment, and resentment towards the U.S. state? How many more wars or conflicts will we start or uphold in the pursuit of oil and U.S. corporate interests? And how many more budgets will the U.S. military get of over $883 billion as budgeted in the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, and a mere fraction of that actually distributed towards domestic public services like infrastructure, healthcare, social services, public schools, the list goes on and on. Many of the undecided voters that I know, they're undecided because they're tired and angry and resentful. That every 4 years, especially for people my age and younger, the number one argument to vote for one candidate over the other is we can't let the other person win. And quite frankly, saying that candidate Y is not candidate X is not a good enough argument anymore for a lot of us. And we're really fed up with our votes being held hostage in that kind of way, as if a candidate is owed our vote by virtue of just not being another person. This voting of a lesser of two evils is simply not cutting it for more and more people, especially younger people, whose entire living memories of U.S. presidential elections is rooted in this argument. For those struggling to talk to voters who are undecided about participating in an election and in a system that they believe only serves to maintain the status quo of a handful of winners, socioeconomically speaking, and a mountain of losers who are increasingly priced out of the ability not just to buy a home, but even to rent, and who are one emergency medical bill away from bankruptcy, a conversation about voting or not needs to be rooted in my next primary thing that I keep top of mind at the polls, which is validation. It is okay to feel angry and resentful. It's probably even justified to feel that way. And on the flip side, it is also okay to feel hopeful about what this election could become, what it could produce, what the next president could bring for our country. I've been talking to my own personal mentors a lot, who are really not that much older than me, but they do have just enough years on me that they were really able to help me sort out some of my own internal conflicts looking at this election cycle and probably all election cycles in the US moving forward. As someone who is really deeply online and does a lot of work that is based in online culture, discourse, and media, there's a very particular way that arguments need to be presented online in order to gain traction in the metrics. It's a tone that's steeped in a sense of, I know more than you, therefore you must listen to me. And it's a righteousness that I don't really fault creators for, because it is necessary in order to get those likes, comments, reactions, stitches, etc. Because it is these overt displays of confidence that keep people from swiping away. And especially in short-form video content like Instagram Reels or TikTok, you have 60 seconds total, but really only the initial 5 to 10 seconds to convince a user why they should not scroll away and why they should keep listening to you. And don't get me wrong, self-righteousness, especially on political issues that very often come with moral judgment attached, has always been prevalent in these types of exchanges between people. But that natural inclination towards self-righteousness, I believe, has been greatly exacerbated by internet culture seeping into our IRL lives, IRL being in real life, for those who don't know. And I can talk about the ways that internet culture and the nature of how we interact online juxtaposed to how we act offline for hours, but that's definitely a completely different episode for a probably completely different podcast. The point is that we need to lead with more empathy and understand that to some, Kamala is quote unquote obviously not as bad or evil as Trump, and to others, Trump is quote unquote obviously not as bad or evil as Kamala, and then to others still, they're both equally bad and evil. Instead of disregarding why someone feels that way, I think it's more helpful and beneficial to try to understand what value systems or priorities a person has that leads them to those conclusions. Voters on both sides of the aisle, as I've seen, are equally capable of some pretty vitriolic language and feelings towards the opposite political party. But the reality is that it's just sad and frustrated, and for various reasons have been left feeling neglected and taken advantage of, regardless of political affiliation or belief, for way too long. In conclusion, the primary things I keep in mind are that, yes, this will likely be a close election, so depending on how gerrymandered your county or election district is, every vote is definitely going to count this year. Also, I personally view foreign policy a total wash in this election, and that includes nuclear issues. I have been left feeling so drained by this campaign season because the prospects for the specific kinds of progress that I most want to see are pretty dull and uninspiring. But despite that, I have been persuaded to vote because people I've spoken to didn't just automatically write me off as some out of touch with reality young person who doesn't understand or who's acting foolish or is uninformed or misinformed. I've had difficult conversations with people who spoke to me, a disillusioned young person left feeling undecided about voting, as a person actually capable of intellectual thought behind my reservations about the election. I was spoken to with an empathy and a validation and an understanding that I don't otherwise see in conversations around politics broadly, but even more so in conversation about this election cycle. When I'm at the polls, my heart absolutely goes out to everyone who feels disillusioned or disregarded by the system. And ultimately, this is kind of my bonus point. The thing I keep in mind the most in this election and in response to all of my earlier points about reservations on casting a ballot is that casting a ballot does not mean I shut up after November 5th. If anything, I will continue to be even louder about my criticisms, no matter who wins. And when/if I do eventually grow too old or too tired to be quite so rambunctious and up in arms about what policies and legislations I believe to be right, I will sure as hell remain thankful to those younger than me that can take up the helm and take up the bullhorn. And I'm going to support their dissent no matter how inconvenient their dissent might be to, say, the traffic on the roads or the daily affairs of an institution running. Maybe, no, in fact, I will calm down physically as I get older. That's unfortunate reality of aging. But I definitely don't want to calm down in my solidarity over issues, no matter what age I grow to be.
And our second guest today is Alan Hester.
I'm Alan Hester, and I am the legislative representative for nuclear disarmament and Pentagon spending at the Friends Committee for National Legislation. So as I head into the voting booth, what weighs most on my mind is how we navigate a whole plethora of unprecedented global challenges that we're collectively facing, right? The 2024 election carries tremendous consequences. We have escalating international tensions, growing inequality here at home, the rise of disinformation, and the climate crisis. So none of these issues exist in their own silos. I mean, I think who we choose now matters more than ever. For me, though, I think the key question is, who is best suited to manage rising global tensions with the most level-headed and thoughtful approach? And I think there's a clear division on how the candidates approach the use of military force. And that's really what's weighing on me. One candidate is very clearly focusing on this re-emerging peace through strength narrative. And it suggests that we need to outpace all adversaries militarily, regardless of the financial or human cost, often very reminiscent of the Cold War posturing we've seen in the past. And there's even been talk by certain advisors about a potential return to above-ground nuclear testing as a show of willingness to destroy any potential threats. And if that wasn't enough, there's even been more recent rhetoric about using military force on U.S. citizens in this election cycle, kind of defining it as enemies from within that need to be addressed militarily, which is obviously really scary. The other candidate, I think, at a rhetorical level, leans much more heavily on diplomacy as a key tool for national security, sees military force as a last resort, only after diplomatic avenues are exhausted. So as we watch the Pentagon budget and the military budget more broadly soar to nearly $1 trillion annually, the question is not just who's going to prioritize a more reasonable and sustainable military budget, but how is that military power going to be wielded? And I think voters must ask, if a major global escalation happens in the next few years, who do we trust to respond most thoughtfully? So that's what's top of mind for me as I head into the voting booth.
And closing out this episode is Esther Im.
Hi, my name is Esther Im. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Peace and Security at Foreign Policy for America, and I cover our Iran, China, North Korea nuclear issues.
Given her work on nuclear issues in those regions, what's at the top of her mind as we head into this election when it comes to how the U.S. should tackle nuclear weapons policy?
North Korea has been a significant problem because of its nuclear weapons program. For many decades now, North Korea has defied international norms and treaties to pursue a nuclear weapons program and ballistic missiles program. And successive U.S. presidents since the 1990s have tried to stop North Korea's development of these weapons. But despite limited resources, significant sanctions, and strong objections from the international community, North Korea is now a state in possession of somewhere upwards of 50 nuclear weapons and enough fissile material to produce perhaps up to 90 weapons, according to experts. And this is a big problem because of North Korea weapons program. We see high levels of militarization of the Korean Peninsula, which increases risk of conflict. And because of those weapons, we also see North Korea and South Korea calibrating its defense policies accordingly. And every year that we do not make any progress on limiting North Korea's weapons program and rolling it back and negotiating some control over them, and hopefully the dismantlement of those programs, the risks increase, not just on kind of the nuclear side of things, but the conventional side as well, because they kind of act as this cover that prevents a cover for increased conventional military deterrence. I think Iran and North Korea actually share some of the same dilemmas of two countries which are highly authoritarian, which have kind of significant implications for the geopolitics of their region because of their nuclear weapons program and their kind of provocative behavior. But I think differently than North Korea, Iran does not yet have nuclear weapons. And so the kind of threshold for negotiations is much lower in some sense. There's still possibility to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And the cost of negotiating that, I would argue, is a lot lower, right, than a country like North Korea. And I think these two issues also demonstrate how important nuclear diplomacy and nuclear negotiations are, because neither of these issues can be resolved with military responses. The idea that there can be limited military strikes to destroy these programs is a farce. And so, right, these countries have hardened their facilities, put them underground, and strikes against them, I think, would only increase the risk of other escalation between the United States and these countries. We have our own kind of issues, nuclear issues with Russia, given the stalling of the New START treaty. But I guess what I would like to mention on Russia, especially when it comes to these problems of Iran and North Korea, this is a big challenge. I think the geopolitics, Russia has changed the geopolitics surrounding, especially this North Korea problem. Russia and China alike are much less likely to work with the United States to constrain North Korea's program. Not that they were enthusiastic partners before, but given the strains that exist between U.S. and Russia over Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, and even the U.S.-China strain under strategic competition, North Korea has a much freer hand to expand and fortify its program. And renewed security cooperation, especially between North Korea and Russia, I think is enhancing North Korea's program. Analysts believe that in exchange for ammunition and missiles from North Korea, Russia is supplying food assistance and even technical knowledge to North Korea to enhance its capabilities. And, we've seen the recent reporting of potential North Korean troops being sent to Ukraine to fight against that war as well. And so North Korea is able to relieve some of its pressure through this security cooperation. And I think there's less incentive to engage in those kind of negotiations, given everything else that's going on in the world. And I think whoever comes into office next year is going to have to overcome significant historical and trust baggage. The collapse of previous negotiations between the US and North Korea, I think, have created a lot of wariness, both in the US and North Korea, on the utility of nuclear negotiations and whether each side can deliver on the terms of an agreement. We saw under the Trump administration a willingness to engage in leader-to-leader dialogue and negotiations, which I think ultimately the U.S. needs to figure out how to do because North Korea is an authoritarian country and Kim Jong-un is the ultimate decision maker. So I think we need to let go of some wariness of that kind of engagement in order to make progress on this issue. At the same time, I think we need also to empower policymakers who are thinking about practical negotiation formats that include step-by-step processes and don't produce this kind of all-for-nothing gamble when it comes to North Korea's nuclear program, because that is not what will be successful. Congress will have a huge impact, not on the substance of foreign policy, but the ability for a president to enact his or her foreign policy. The politics around foreign policy will be different. And I think, as an example, North Korea is one where I think this will be particularly salient. So if a Trump administration comes into office and President Trump wants to negotiate with North Korea, I think Republicans, congressional members, for example, are going to be less reticent to disagree with that, even though historically they have not supported nuclear negotiations. We saw this under his last administration, and that kind of political alignment allowed Trump to do that. I think similarly, if President Harris wanted to engage in those kind of negotiations, a Republican Congress, because of the politics of this, I think would be a significant obstacle to her ability to engage in nuclear negotiations. There would be a lot more political barriers for her to do so, which is why it's so important, I think, for any president to work closely with Congress to make sure that they are being brought on and that they are buying into the negotiations that are occurring. In the past, members of Congress have been invited to observe those negotiations, and I think that's a particularly important practice for the next administration to do. I think one challenge for the next administration, as we've seen, this is the case for every president, is that each president has limited political capital that they can expend on various issues. And historically, I think the North Korea nuclear challenge has been a high risk, but perhaps a low priority. And presidents have been unwilling to, I think, expend the energy and the capital that is necessary to push agreements forward. And I think for Iran, too, this is going to be a challenge given the geopolitics of the Middle East and the current crisis in the Middle East to renew and find a path forward on constraining Iran's nuclear program because of the kind of high political cost of all of these things. So that will be a significant challenge. But at the same time, I think neglecting to find ways to diffuse these nuclear issues will give those presidents a much freer hand to engage on the broader security challenges presented by these countries, right? Addressing the North Korea nuclear program, the nuclear challenge, will be one less security crisis in the Indo-Pacific to deal with. Preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons will give it one less defense against its malign activities in the region. In some ways, all of these things will, in a nuclear-armed Iran, will be more emboldened to engage in, I would argue, provocative actions in the region. And so the more we can do to kind of break through these kind of nuclear defenses, the more that we can do to diffuse, I think, the defense that these nuclear weapons provide to these countries, the more we can actually address the kind of broader security issues.
Thank you for tuning into this season of Nuclear Ballot. While we didn't tell you who to vote for, we hoped we armed you with the vital insights from the experts who really get this critical issue, as we were just days away from this election. Don't forget to follow us on social media for updates on the next season, and if you want to support our mission to make the world safer from the threat of nuclear weapons, check out plowshares.org. Thank you so much for listening to this season of Nuke Talk, the Nuclear Ballot, how the U.S. election shapes nuclear policy. See you next season.